Please welcome Laura.
You can use this mic and you can answer it here by clicking on there or using your, arrow, whichever you like to do. Let's see if that works. These arrows. Okay.
All right. Well, it's still morning, right? Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. And yes, Judy, friend and colleague. And I just want to say first, to put together that pharmacists and pharmacy technicians have a role to play in human trafficking long before pharmacists did. Judy was the one who realized that we needed to be addressing this. And so thank you, Judy, for inviting me to participate in Niagara and again now, and I hope many more to come. And so I just want to, can we just give her a round of applause for everything that you do? I really appreciate it. And I'm so glad to be here with you today. And are there people online too? Yes. Okay. Okay. Fabulous. All right. So I have a lot to cover today, and the presentation has changed since Niagara Falls. So I'm going to kind of go through quickly. Judy said you'll never make it through 50 slides. So I'll go through and then 10 minutes before, stop me so that we can have questions, and the rest I can send to you. So you can see here that what we want to do is just look at the basic physical and mental health issues of human trafficking victims and survivors. And the indicators of human trafficking, especially in a pharmacy and pharmacy technician setting. And then I want you to know the signs and indicators of trafficking victims and survivors, and then how to respond appropriately. So really 3 learning objectives today, but a lot to cover within those 3. So I'm not going to read all of this, but that's going to be there for you. And anybody can have this slide presentation if they want. I want to start with a story. I often train with a survivor. When I don't have a survivor with me, I have stories to tell of survivors who've been through the hell of human trafficking, and it's always good to do that because that's why we're doing this work. And so this young woman said, this is from one of the focus groups. I've done about 50 or 60 of them around the country in the last 5 or 7 years. And this young woman said, when I turned 13, I'd had enough of the abuse in my own home and I ran away. And I didn't know where to go, so I went to the center of town and I was hanging out there. And a guy came up to me and he started to chat me up, and he was talking to me and asked me, what I was doing. And I ended up telling him that I'd run away from home. And he said, do you have a place to stay? And I said, no. And he offered me that I could crash at his house for that night, basically. And so I ended up going home with him. And first thing he did was take out a bottle of gin and offer it to me. And after I drank it, I felt sick. And the next thing I knew, I woke up and I was all sick and wet and hurt. And basically he had drugged that gin. The next day he put me out on the street and he told me what I had to do. And when I said I didn't want to do it, he took out a gun and he pistol whipped me. And that's how I got into this life, and I couldn't get out. Over the next years, he hit me, punched me, beat me, kicked me, slashed me with a razor. I had forced unprotected sex with customers. I got pregnant twice, had 2 abortions. I have so many illnesses and injuries: hepatitis C, STDs, stomach problems, back pain, a lot of psychological issues. I overdosed twice on drugs and was taken to the hospital where they saved me, but then they released me to my trafficker again. And this is kind of a summary that I like to use because it has what I call the 3 I's: injuries, illnesses, and impairments. Injuries from the violence that's perpetrated both by the trafficker and by the purchasers. Illnesses, serious communicable illnesses and non-communicable and acute and chronic illnesses, a lot of those. And then impairments like substance use, abuse, overdose, addiction, and also a lot of mental health issues. So that this story kind of encompasses that. So before we go any further, just a few kind of definitions of what we mean when we say. So first of all, when I say victim and survivor, I mean two kind of different things. Victims are those who are still trapped in the trafficking situation. Survivors are those who are out and on their journey in some way or another to healing. And both terms are, I think, correct to use. And our Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the law that passed in the United States 20 years ago, in the year 2000, actually 25 years ago now, defines human trafficking. And I'm not going to read this legal definition to you. Instead, I'm going to show you this diagram, which kind of illustrates what the legal definition is. So it's broken up into three parts that you have to prove in a court of law. I'm a lawyer. So actions, means, and purpose. You have to have at least one action: recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining. And then there's three others that were added for sex trafficking: patronizing, soliciting, and advertising, to try to get at that demand side of human trafficking. Why all these actions? When we first started to draft and pass the law, people were saying to us, the legislators were saying, why do we need another law? Why can't we use our kidnapping laws? Just use our rape laws. Well, kidnapping only gets to that one act of taking somebody holding them against their will. Rape only gets to that one sexual assault. And in trafficking, you have a whole pipeline of activity, from those who recruit and the guards and the transporters and most of you know this. For the most part, it's organized criminal activity in our country. 3 or more is defined as organized crime, and there's almost always more than one or two involved. So in any event, this was to get to that whole pipeline of activity, and it updated our laws in that way. And then how is it done? By force, fraud, or coercion, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and unpack it in a few minutes. But the main thing for health providers is that double asterisk there: minors who are induced or who are found in commercial sex are what we call per se or automatically considered victims of trafficking. In other words, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for minors, because they can't consent. They can't voluntarily consent. And this has come up when I've been doing trainings with Title X clinics. They'll say, oh, but she said it was okay for her boyfriend to sell her. And we had to say, no, she's 16. She can't consent to that. She's automatically a victim of trafficking, and you're automatically involved in a crime if you're not reporting it. And that's why that double asterisk is important, because pharmacy technicians can be mandated reporters. Is that right, Judy? They can be mandated reporters if the state regulates it so we want you to know that if you find a minor that you suspect or confirm is a trafficking victim, that needs to be reported. And then what's the purpose? Really, there are only two. This has this list, but it's sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And the first four: forced labor, involuntary servitude, debt, bondage, and slavery, those are our statutes that comprise the forced labor. And then commercial sex, prostitution, pimping, pandering, procuring, that's the other type of, that's the sex trafficking. So that in a nutshell is what human trafficking consists of. And I just want everybody to be on the same page. So for a long time after our law passed, we thought of this as a law enforcement problem, really. It's crime, there are criminals involved, and there are victims. And then we thought of it maybe as a human rights abuse. And it wasn't until I started doing some focus groups with survivors that I realized, no, it's also a health issue. It's a public and private health issue. And that there are a lot of reasons why we should be focusing on health, even before we focus on crime and the sort of crime outcomes. So from 2012 to 2014, I embarked on a nationwide study. I went to 22 cities across the United States, and I held these series of focus groups with survivors. And when we first started, people said, you won't even be able to get people in the room and who will admit that they were survivors of trafficking. Well, it turned out that that wasn't the case. Just like with rape and sexual assault, it had been a taboo topic, but people that had this happen to them wanted to tell what had happened to them and wanted to be in a safe place and be able to share with someone what the issues were. So we would go into town and we would work with either a shelter or with one survivor, and we would say, we're coming into town, we're doing a survey on health and human trafficking, and if you want to participate, let us know, RSVP. And we would get 3 or 4 RSVPs, and then we would arrive in town and there would be 20, 30 people in the room because word of mouth had gotten around about this study, and we were able to get 500 people eventually to participate in this. So we did a kind of a mixed methods approach. We had structured interviews with guided questions in this focus group where we would ask them about their childhood. Were there adverse childhood events? What had happened to them? How were they recruited? How transported? What was a day in the life of? What were their traffickers like? Trying to gather, anecdotal information as much as we could. And we recorded all that. And that gave us this qualitative data that even to this day, we're still parsing. And then we administered a questionnaire. And that gave us quantitative data, and everybody got the same questionnaire. And the questionnaire was based on the ICD-10, which all of you know. Survivors were asked to report on 200 plus discrete physical and mental conditions that they might have. And then we also asked a series of open-ended questions about healthcare providers, because we wanted to know not just what were their health issues, but also what type of facilities did they visit and whether the healthcare provider knew or asked about their situation or suspected something. And so we were asking about the healthcare provider too. And this is kind of what we got. This is one, and I'm sending a supplemental packet, and there are a couple of more surveys so that you can see that they were just circled like this everywhere. The survivors had so many physical health and so many mental health problems they were struggling with, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 10 years after, recovery or being recovered from a trafficking situation or having escaped or being rescued. Then we also asked about, here you can see the questions about injuries. And the reason we unpacked it like this is because when we started, we did a pilot study and we were asking the survivors, were you trafficked? And they were saying no. And we were asking, was there force, fraud, or coercion? And they were saying no. And we knew they were trafficked because they were in a shelter waiting to testify against their trafficker. And we knew there was force, fraud, or coercion because they were over 18. And so there had to be something that had happened to them. So then we started to ask, were you ever hit? Were you beaten? Were you kicked? Were you punched? Were you stabbed? Were you burned with this? Oh yeah, that. Yeah. And then we got this kind of a thing where we could say, there is clearly a lot of violence in human trafficking and a lot of injuries resulting from that violence. And then you can see also that we were asking, where did you go for help and for healthcare? And did the health provider know anything about it? And then finally, we asked a whole series of questions about pregnancy, we were asking about gynecological, reproductive, and procreative issues because we had found in the pilot study that there's so much pregnancy in human trafficking, and I'll show you that. So you can sort of see here, this person was trafficked in Tennessee. She was recruited when she was 13 by a motorcycle gang. He had almost a little city in a little town outside Tennessee with a series of trailers that operated as a kind of trailer brothels. She got out of it when she was 33, so 20 years she was trapped in this. And you can see here that she had you know, we thought we knew pretty much everything by the time we had gotten to Nashville, and we're running these focus groups, and she had children that were born into the trafficking situation, and so we were realizing, wait a second, there's intergenerational issues too. And then I knew there was pregnancy, I knew there was abortion, but I didn't know there were so many multiple abortions. This person had 17 abortions during the time she was trafficked, most of them at the same clinic. And so, you know, we're realizing we need a lot of training, particularized training to make sure that people are catching this much earlier than than it's being caught. She finally was rescued when her trafficker turned to her and said, "You're getting too old for this. I want you to go to the nearest middle school and recruit kids who are your age, who are the age you were when I trafficked, when I first recruited you." And by that time she was addicted to heroin. She had organ failure. She was really, really sick. And she said to herself, "I don't want this to happen to one more person." And she was courageous enough. These guys were really bad. They were a very powerful motorcycle gang. They were robbing banks and running drugs as well as trafficking human beings. The motorcycle leader's brother was the head of the chief of police, in that town. And so every time there was a raid, they were tipped off beforehand, whether it was local or an FBI. But she knew their whole modus operandi, and she knew who was corrupt and who wasn't. And she was able to find a police officer, a law enforcement officer, and tell him that she needed to be in touch with, the federal law enforcement. And she catalyzed a raid, and then she ended up testifying against him. And that whole crew got locked up for 20 years. And I met her 4 months later in the shelter when we were doing this survey. So learning about the stories of what has happened to these survivors and how best to intervene, it's really important to have that survivor-informed piece as a part of it. So now I'm just going to really quickly, and Judy, you'll see, I'll zip through these. You can have these slides. This is the final tabulation that's in the peer-reviewed paper that we published. Physical health problems. 99% of survivors had at least one physical health problem, but most had multiple physical health problems. And you see, we categorized them like the ICD-10 did: neurological and general health, and injuries and cardiovascular and respiratory were kind of tied at 68%. Gastro, dental, we tabulated anything above 50% for the purposes of the paper. 98% had at least one psychological health problem, but most of them, again, had multiple psychological health problems. Here you can see it says 12 was the average number that most of them reported. Depression and flashbacks and shame and guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder and attempted suicide or suicidal ideation, really serious physical and mental health issues as a result of being trafficked. Again, reproductive issues, 71% had at least one pregnancy, and I don't have this on the slide, but 22% had 5 pregnancies or more during the time they were trafficked. 67% had at least one STD, but most of them had multiple. 55% had at least one abortion. 29.9% had multiple abortions during the time they were trafficked. So that's 30% added to that 55% that had one. 54% had at least one miscarriage, but again, 29.2% had multiple miscarriages during the time they were trafficked. And then you can see other reproductive issues. And then here again, violence in trafficking, a lot of violence, because as many survivors said, you don't do this without some kind of force. One of my colleagues said, well, there's that moment of coercion, but what we found talking to all these survivors is that there are hundreds of moments of coercion in trafficking, and they occur over and over again. I'll just give you one example in Utah, where I went in thinking there's not going to be very many survivors here because it's such a conservative state and conservative city. And we did 3 focus groups in Utah. They were all packed. And one of the survivors said that she had her trafficker was advertising her online for something that she didn't want to do. And she got into an argument in a hotel. And he said, get in that room and do what I said or else. And she said, or else what? And he said, he took out his gun and he said, or else I'll shoot you. And she kind of laughed. And she said, you wouldn't shoot me. And he said, I said, get in there. And when she wouldn't go in, he shot her in the thigh. And then he took her, he bundled her into his car, drove her to Salt Lake City main hospital. There's one main hospital there, walked her into the emergency ward and reported it as a drive-by shooting, stayed with her while they patched her up, and then took her home again. And 6 months later, this is in like 2005, 2006. So we were only beginning to realize that there were health issues and nobody had really been trained. She was brought in again. She had a wound in her other thigh from this same trafficker where he had shot her when she refused to do something. So, and they patched her up again. And of course they had to report the gunshot wound, but nobody thought to look beneath the surface about what else might be happening in addition to, you know, this quote unquote, sort of double drive-by shooting that she had. So a lot of violence in trafficking, and important to begin to do that extra look. Substance use, again, survivors have said to me, you cannot do this for any period of time without being numbed against it. One survivor said, I had to take anything that was available. I didn't care. She said, they would ask me at the rehabilitation center, what's your drug of choice? And she said, I don't have a drug of choice. Anything that was available, I took it. I took multiple things all together to numb myself. I wanted to be up above my body, looking down on what was happening to me. I couldn't bear to be inside my own body. And so a lot of substance use and abuse in human trafficking, and mostly whatever they could get their hands on. So you can see alcohol and marijuana and cocaine were the top 3. And then finally, victim contact with healthcare providers. And this is where we first realized, and Judy, this is where I think I first met you. I was just finishing calculating all of this. They wouldn't let me use it in our first training. Now it's been quoted 6,000 times in peer-reviewed journals all over the world, but we found that 87.8% had had contact with healthcare providers during the time they were being trafficked. And so it became clear that healthcare providers were the first responders, even more so than law enforcement. At that point, we were all saying law enforcement is a first responder, but really all of you who are involved in health, in the provision of healthcare, are the ones who are the first responders to trafficking victims and survivors. And here it shows kind of where they went, and the majority went, as might be expected, to a hospital emergency ward, but then to any type of clinic, and then we've kind of broken down the clinics. So why do we want you, as someone who's in the healthcare field, to know about human trafficking? Because when someone's been trafficked, they are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually devastated by this. And these are the mugshots of one person, starting with a police chief who took a first picture, and then he got trained and he went back and he gathered all the mugshots of this person over maybe just a couple of years. And you can see how quickly she deteriorated. And the same here on the bottom. One person starts out young and fresh and innocent, and you know, by the time they're rescued, they're just really in bad shape. And this is why we want you to be able to identify a person who might have been trafficked, to know the signs and indicators, and to know how to respond appropriately. That's really the main thing. And when we get finished with this, I'll come back to the last question there, because I'd love to learn from you also, as pharmacy technicians, what you've seen and heard. I just trained a group of respiratory therapists, and afterwards, a big conference, their annual conference, and just like yours. And afterwards, one of them came up to me and said, 3 weeks ago, somebody was in the room in the emergency ward, and she said, respiratory therapists, we're kind of the quiet ones, but you know, if you don't breathe, you don't live. And this person had gone into a respiratory arrest after an abortion and been taken to the emergency ward where this respiratory therapist worked. And she didn't speak any English. She only spoke Spanish, and she was accompanied by a really burly guy. And he was speaking for her. And turned out that, and this is my home state, Virginia, and he said, you know, we're on our way from New York down to Florida. And, you know, she went into this respiratory arrest and need to be treated. And they were smart enough to be able to figure out what to do. And there's a slide here, but I'll just tell you now. They separated this young girl, found a translator, and she was able to tell them, you know, that she was in trouble. And when they went back into the waiting room to find this guy, he had gone. Turned out she was Venezuelan. He was part of Nicaragua. And they were moving from New York down to Florida. They were moving a bunch of their girls that they were selling. So you know, it can happen anywhere, anytime, and it's morphing all the time too, because of who's involved in this. And can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what's important for you all is that you are providing healthcare, and you might encounter trafficking victims and survivors. New research is showing that victims of trafficking go to drugstores with or without their traffickers, fill prescriptions, purchase items from pharmacies. In one of the focus groups, a young woman told me that every week they were taken to get, you know, everything from nail polish and nail polish remover to sanitary napkins and they were taken in, and they had a guard with them. But they were in the pharmacy, and they were oftentimes at the pharmacy counter. And so you are receiving and confirming prescription orders, preparing and filling prescriptions, and you are, most importantly, you're the face across the counter. You are interacting with customers and answering questions. And so you're seeing these patients who may be trafficking victims. And so we want you to have your antenna up. We want you to know what the signs and indicators might be. And here's other things that you all are doing that I think that are where there might be an intersection with human trafficking. A lot of the communicable diseases, the hepatitises and TB, and you know, we had a case in California where the federal government raided 13 brothels at the same time that were trafficking. They were massage parlors that were fronts for brothels where young women were being trafficked. And they arrested all of the managers and those who were running it, and they apprehended at the same time 125 young women, girls, young women and girls as young as 12 and 13 years old. Most of them from Pacific Coast countries, Philippines and Thailand and China, and there were 2 or 3 other countries. Anyway, 80% of them tested positive for TB. So they had been in that, they had been brought over illegally, obviously, and so nobody had tested them. And so you can see the kinds of issues that might occur. So, and here's some more examples of pharmacy providing healthcare. Many of you now have the ability to do kinds of diagnostic tests that might also interact on like anything from like strep and HIV, hepatitis C. All those are things that we heard reported as from our survivors as serious illnesses that they had. And then finally, whoops, yeah. And then finally, there are some distinctive prescription filling patterns that we're really in the foothills of consciousness on this right now. So we need to learn from you. But, frequent purchases of pregnancy tests and emergency contraception, regular filling of medications for STDs, frequent requests for early refills, pain meds, desperate need for pain meds, all of those kinds of things. One survivor told us that her trafficker, she was feeling suicidal, and her trafficker took her to a psychiatrist that they were working with. Unfortunately, there are some bad guys in the medical field too. And he had prescribed some kind of psychiatric medication for her that did not work and resulted in, some really serious side effects. So all of those kinds of things we need to be watching for, and there may be others. And so I also have a couple of case studies there that are pharmacy centric. Here's a young woman who said, I grew up in a small town in Mexico. When I was 16, I was sold by my dad to pay off a large gambling debt that he had. He sold me to a trafficker who had trafficked me from Mexico to Florida. I was held against my will in a brothel with 10 other girls. We were sold for sex 7 days a week and also forced to do janitorial work on weekdays. Even every week, the trafficker took us to the drugstore to buy personal items. When he was there, he would go to the pharmacy counter and purchase condoms by the boxes of 1,000. Now, who does that? She said, who does that? Why didn't that raise a flag for somebody? But it didn't ever. And so these are the kinds of things that we want you to be aware of. And then you have to school me on then what what to do. Judy, we really need to work on what do we do once we have a flag like this? What's the right thing to do? So here this pharmacy technician was literally she was face to face with a trafficker. And so what are the kinds of things that possibly somebody could do? Here's another case study. When I was 16, I was trafficked in Minneapolis. My trafficker took us to high-end hotels down in Minneapolis, where he approached men in the hotel and sold us there. Most of the men didn't want to wear a condom, so my trafficker had one of his girls, so kind of the madam really, who was over them, purchase Plan B the morning after for us and give it to us when we came home at night. I took a lot of it not knowing what it was, and my body is still recovering 5 years later. And she said to us that she was in the hospital twice for hemorrhaging, and no one thought to ask a question about what might have caused it. Well, it was this, Thursday through Sunday, she was being sold in these high-end hotels. Sunday night, they were taking Plan B, Sunday and Monday, taking the Plan B, and then she was in the hospital for hemorrhaging. And so knowing what those signs and symptoms are and then what to do is really important. Okay, and there may be more stories, and if there are stories here in this room, we would love to hear them. And as soon as I'm through this, I'll tell you the project that Judy and I are working on. But let's just really quickly go through a couple more things here. Encountering barriers. Why do we need to be proactive in the healthcare field? Because most victims don't self-identify. Unlike a robbery where somebody picks up the phone, calls the police and says, help, I've been robbed, and the police come out. Trafficking victims don't pick up the phone and say, help, I'm being trafficked. They just don't do it. They're not in a position to do it for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they lack knowledge about the crime. A lot of times they fear the trafficker. The traffickers are they use threats and intimidation and violence to maintain their power over victims. Sometimes they're not doing so much to the victims themselves as they are threatening the victim's family, particularly their children or their sisters or their parents. And so, the victim will stay quiet because of that, because they fear arrest or law enforcement action, or they fear deportation or immigration action. All of these are reasons why we need to be proactive, because they're not going to come forward themselves. What are some of the signs and indicators for pharmacy technicians? From the outside looking in, if they don't have proper identification, driver's license, passport, social security, if they're escorted or guarded by someone, if someone else is speaking for them all the time, if they don't have an identifiable address or home. One survivor said, or if they're disoriented or unable to identify their whereabouts or their family. One survivor said her trafficker's circuit was Honolulu, Hawaii to Las Vegas, Nevada, down to Los Angeles, up to San Francisco, and then back to Honolulu, Hawaii. And he did every week. And she said every week he traveled with a quote unquote stable of girls. There were about 4 of them, including at least one minor. And she said, we had no idea where we were any one week, in what city we were in, what was going on. Twice she was taken to the hospital, and she could not tell the person where she was and where her home was. And she was not able to identify that. And so any of that kind of disorientation or inability to say where a person lives, that's all a sign and indicator. Wearing inappropriate clothing. One survivor said, they had me out in the middle of winter in these tiny little, tank tops and high heels. And and we're not saying any one of these, that's it, trafficking victim, but we are saying, taken as a whole, these are signs and indicators, they're red flags that if you see them, they should sort of raise concern, and then you can do hopefully some further investigation. Here's some other ways. If there are requests for STI testing, pregnancy testing, contraception, these are all a medical physician who works with us on commercially sexually exploited children wrote these up. Acute sexual assault, injury from physical assault, some injury from hazardous workplace. We had a young man say that he was working on a rooftop. He was a roofing crew and fell off, broke his arm, and both he and the foreman who were on the job were absolutely did not want the young man to be taken to the hospital to have his arm set. And the homeowner was like, absolutely also, she was adamant, no, you're not going to fall off my roof, and I'm not going to have you, not go to the hospital. And so she called the police. They took this young man to the hospital. Turned out it was part of a roofing crew. A lot of young men, 15, 16, 17 years old from Mexico, had been trafficked up into these roofing crews, these traveling roofing crews. They follow where the hailstorms are, where the, tropical storms and fix roofs for really cheap. And she uncovered a trafficking ring. Drug overdose. We talked a little bit about that. And then knife, gunshot, other weapon wound. Weapon wounds are definitely an indicator. And then finally, here are some others. I'm not going to read this whole, but any of these that I have to do with sexual, multiple partners, multiple pregnancies, multiple miscarriages, multiple past abortions, multiple STDs. All of these are signs and indicators that somebody may be being trafficked or may have been being trafficked in the past. And finally, these are in the medical exam room, which, sometimes some of you may have that opportunity if you're giving a shot, or if you're you're in one of these new, I'm forgetting, Judy, I know that there are several different types of of pharmacies, but some of you may be in a position to be looking at somebody. I recently had a foot wound treated in a pharmacy, and so they were looking at my whole leg. And so there may be an opportunity for you to do that. So let's just, before we do anything else, also talk about barriers on the healthcare side, which would be on your side. What would be barriers if you don't know what human trafficking is, or you don't have adequate knowledge of the federal, state, and local laws? If you're just checking off the boxes, a lot of healthcare providers are sort of like, are you safe? Yes, check it off. If you think it'll be too time consuming or complex to deal with it, I've literally had doctors say to me, oh my God, I don't even want to know, because then I'd have to try to find that person a shelter, and I'd have to try to catalyze a rescue, and I don't want to get involved. Sometimes doctors say I can't do anything because of HIPAA laws. So we have in your supplemental packet that you'll get a statement from the Department of Health and Human Services that says that HIPAA was not meant to protect traffickers. It's meant to protect patient confidentiality, and how to make sure that you can abide by HIPAA and still report trafficking if you suspect or confirm it. Sometimes there's a lack of trauma-informed care. How many of you have had trauma-informed care? Have you gone through any kind of a trauma-informed care class? It's something for the future. Yeah, important, and definitely a part of this. I don't do it myself, but I think it's important, because trauma-informed somebody who's giving trauma-informed care is much more likely to get a disclosure from somebody about what's really happening to them, as opposed to the story their trafficker told them to tell. Okay, so those kinds of things. And so then there are best practices, and how am I doing on time here? Okay, good. These are 5 best practices that we've identified, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. And as I say, I'm not doing a training on these, but I'm just identifying them as best practices. So victim-centered approach, first of all, what do we mean by that? All we mean by that is that the safety and well-being of the patient / victim is paramount, and that that has to take priority in all manner of procedures, and whatever you're doing, that should take priority. And that's not dissimilar to patient-centered care. It's just a little more heightened because somebody may really be the victim of a serious crime. And then I just talked about a trauma-informed approach. This isn't a training on it. This is from the Department of Defense's 4 R's on trauma-informed approach. And I'm sorry, I have to have my glasses off to see you and my glasses on to read. Realizes, so the 4 R's, realize the widespread impact of trauma. And in this case, it's complex trauma and polyvictimization, because it's happening over and over and over again. It's not just one sexual assault or one, day of labor trafficking. It's just a day in, day out, 24/7. And right now I'm gathering for the Department of Defense some of the stories of mass trafficking of from some of the street gangs, and the kind of things that these victims were put through. It's just unbelievable. 14, 16 hours lying flat on their back over and over and over again. One story, open-ended brothel, open-air brothel in San Diego in the strawberry fields, where they literally set down plastic and had these young women lying on their backs from 7 a.m. in the morning until 7, 8, 9 at night. And these men would line up and just come in, and they had an egg timer, 15 minutes per person, over and over. So we're talking about poly-victimization here. Recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in patients and their families and so on, and respond by fully integrating trauma-informed care into all practices and procedures. And then finally, and I've got this outlined in yellow, actively seek to reduce re-traumatization. In other words, if you do uncover somebody who's been trafficked, we don't want that person to have to repeat their story to 10 and 12 other people. We want to figure out a way to get it down, and so that then the person can get the care they need without having to be re-traumatized by telling their story over and over again, or by somebody who doesn't understand what's happened to them and is not their healthcare, the provision of healthcare is not done well. And I can talk about that later, but in any event, and this also very important for all of you, snap judgments in trafficking and first impressions, really. We all do it. We all have first impressions. We all make snap judgments. The new research tells us that that's just the way we cope with all the information that's coming at us at any one time. And so this is not to say that, oh, you're bad, you made a snap judgment. Everybody does it. But in trafficking, snap judgments about patients could obscure the signs and indicators. So he's just a drug addict. She's just a prostitute. That's just a child acting out. Oh, those people are illegal aliens. That's all in that person's head. All of those are snap judgments that health providers from top to bottom, I mean, the best doctors in the world all the way down make on a daily basis. And I have had survivors say, I could be all those things. I could be a drug addict, a prostitute. I could be acting out. I could be an illegal alien, and I could be a trafficking victim. So the one doesn't counter or cancel out the other. And so if you have that snap judgment, oh gosh, that's just so-and-so. And if I have time, I can go back and tell you a story about that's just a child acting out, but I want to make sure I get through everything and have time for questions. Okay, so opportunities for pharmacy technicians. You have unique opportunities to identify victims and respond appropriately by building trust during the first encounter, and you all are at the counters, you have those first encounters, by being patient-centered and victim-centered, by having that trauma-informed approach, by looking beneath the surface of those snap judgments that we were just talking about, and then finally contact and connect with local community organizations. And I think this is all I've been able to get to so far, Judy, and so maybe we can brainstorm together as a group here. But I think for pharmacy technicians, your best opportunities are going to be, if you suspect or confirm something, are going to be to respond by connecting them with somebody else who does this work and who can make a deeper dive into this than you can from behind the counter. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Just I have here, for those who are in a position like in a management position or, able to influence management, that the very best thing is to create human trafficking guidelines and protocols for your healthcare facility or your entity or your pharmacy. That deals with all of this on the front end. And in the packet I'm sending, the supplemental packet, it has a template for a set of guidelines and protocols for pharmacies. And it also has a kind of a method to go through to help you set up a protocol that's tailored for your particular pharmacy. And that's all I'll say about that. But connecting with the community is really important. How many states are represented here, Judy? Do we know? Okay, yeah, that's fabulous. Finding those, that has to be done on a local and state by state basis, but finding those task forces, finding those anti-trafficking organizations, and finding others. Why? Because yes, they have pharmacy issues and they have medical issues, but they also have other things. They may need food, clothing, and shelter. They may need additional treatment from different doctors. They may need a substance use treatment or chemical detox. They may need legal assistance. And, we aren't asking you to do any of that. We're just asking you to know who they can connect with so that they can get all of that. And sometimes it's just one place that you call to say, or one card. Am I running out of time? Okay. Okay. All right. Only 2 or 3 more things. Emerging issues, mandatory reporting. I won't say much about it because the main thing is just know your state mandatory reporting laws and whether they cover pharmacy technicians. And also know that the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act amended CAPTA, which is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, to include child sex trafficking as a form of child abuse. So if you find a child who's been trafficked, they have to be reported. And then here's some language for that, but maybe I'll skip it, Judy, because I can give these slides to everybody. We have some best practices language. And here's the slide on HIPAA. And then here's a slide on documenting human trafficking. And what you need to know about that is that there are 6 new ICD codes. One on suspected sex trafficking and the one on confirmed sex trafficking, one on suspected labor trafficking, one on confirmed labor trafficking, one on suspected sexual exploitation and confirmed sexual exploitation. So just get to know those ICD codes and be familiar with them so that you know what those look like. And so I hope you can see that pharmacy technicians do play an amazingly important and vital role in addressing human trafficking. And I hope to partner with you in the future. Thank you. Oh, she says I have time for a couple of questions. Any questions at all? While you're thinking, I'm just asking, I would like to ask, do any of you think you've ever encountered a trafficking victim? Yeah. Yes, you have. Anybody willing to share a story? Yeah. You have to yell.
Oh, sorry. The Walgreens, she came in with a big prescription for pro-method codeine, and so we called the local police. Then we came to pick her up, and she was scared out of her mind. She was trying to text who was waiting for her in the car, and he got her phone, but after 20 minutes, we just talking to her. She was actually, I was been pretty non-graphic. She was actually from Chicago, and they drove all the way to Nebraska, and they hit multiple pharmacies. And they threatened her. They threatened her family, her parents,
Thank you so much for that. Something I didn't mention is this forced criminality, where the victim is under the control of the trafficker, who's a criminal, and they're often the traffickers will themselves stay in the background, and they will force the victims to rob and to like say there was a fraudulent prescription. That's a great story, and I think I would give permission to use it as a case study. Any others? Anybody else?
I just have a question.
Yes.
So, we know that there's different ways people look that we may be able to see a red flag. Are there signals, facial expressions, anything that we as context should look out for when we're helping fill prescriptions for people, where if they walk up to our windows and they're trying to tell us something but can't verbally say it, what should we look for as technicians?
Yeah, I had slides in here, which when Judy and I were working, the Department of Health and Human Services made me take out because they said people might get, a a false sense of what is going on. And in this case, which was a real case, based on it was a real person and a real trafficker, but they were from a particular, ethnicity. And so I wasn't allowed to use it. And so I think that sometimes you can help me with this and try to figure out how we can do this. They went the opposite direction. I don't know if you remember this, Judy, but every single doctor in the original one that we did was a Black person, and every single victim was a white person. So it's kind of like, I mean, you can't win for losing on these things. It's very difficult. And particularly right now, it's a very difficult time to talk about some of what is going on. But we know there are street gangs who traffic. And we know MS-13 is involved in trafficking. I'm sorry. We know Trenderagua is involved in trafficking. I'm sorry, we just know it. And MS-13 have tattoos, and they tattoo themselves and they tattoo the girls that they're trafficking. And so, but are we allowed to say it right now? It's very, very difficult. And so we have to think about the right way to be able to present what all the issues are, and what without being racist, basically, without being racist. And you can help me with that. I mean, you may know some signs and indicators of the way people look that might be helpful. Yeah. We gotta go. Can I just say that I can maybe send this around with the supplemental, but those were exactly what I had published in this original one. It was the list of do's and don'ts from her pimp. And her pimp said, never look anyone in the eye. That was the first thing, and it was literally, he had written it out. That was the first thing he had told her. Never look me or anyone else in the eye. And so maybe I can share that as just one other thing. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And can I announce, or can you announce, Judy, that what we're...
Let's do it. So you can tell we have a lot of passion here. Laura could talk all day and every bit of it would be interesting. And so that's what makes her good at what she does.